Hello, class. Hopefully, you all are doing fine this week, and welcome to Social Justice Activism Week 2. So, I'm going to refer to my notes so I can really get through the lecture and not make the lecture long. So, let me start off by stating a quote. The quote is: "Every moment is an organizing opportunity. Every person is a potential activist. Every minute, a chance to change the world." And this particular quote that I read is by Dolores Herta, who is a labor leader and a civil rights activist, an early member of the National Farm Workers Association. So, last week we went into details about definitions of what social justice activism is, what it is not, what social movements are, what social movements are not. So, I just want to give a really brief recap. I stated in last week's lecture that a social movement is a large group of people who are structured to promote or resist forms of social change. Social movements are based on who the movement is trying to change and how much change the social movement is supporting. Now, remember, social movements contain many dynamics, contradictions, complexities, and we also must consider social movement and social justice activism analysis, research, conclusions, historical, practical, and theoretical applications when interpreting what social movements are, especially on specific types of social movements. Now, usually social movements, they come about based on deep rooted conflicts and or grievances. Now, according to several scholars, the study and research of social movements have no basis relative to theories to truly understand the totality of social movements. In the 1940s and also in the 1960s, the study of social change in society, social movements received very little attention. But in the 1970s, the term collective action was considered one of the most vigorous forms and areas of sociology. So I really want you all to remember that. Now, why is that? Well, let's investigate all of this. Now, ideas, individuals, events, groups, within organizations, within institutions, as it relates to social movements, they're all tied together in some way, shape, or form. However, the birth of social movements questions traditional practice about how people were and how they currently or presently are treated. So let's discuss some core questions as it relates to social movement analysis. Now, let's talk about some four core questions as we self reflect, as we critically reflect and study. So, based off of those questions that we're going to get into right now, there are four core questions for social movement analysis. Now, what's the result? But again, why? What's the structural? What's the relationship? Between structural change and transformational change and the patterns of conflict we have to consider what these issues and these challenges and these grievances and these conflicts are all about. And we have to look at them very, very deeply from different aspects and from different contexts. Contexts. Now, our social movements expressions of conflict? Have there been changes in main conflicts? And have those main conflicts been addressed by social movements? And along what lines? So these are core questions. So let's think about these questions as it relates to the first set of core questions for social movement analysis. So consider this question: why did black and white children attend separate and often unequal public schools? That's a question. That's something that you should really think about and consider. Another question is, why were women prevented from attaining certain jobs? Another question we all could think about as it relates to issues of conflict and social movements is, why could a person or a male or a man and a woman be drafted in the military at the age of 18 but not able to vote until the age of 21? That's a question. Now, these questions inspire all of us to begin organizing movements to fight against injustices, oppressions, marginalization, and for equal rights for all people. Now, the second set of questions as it relates to the core questions for social movement analysis are, what relates to the role of cultural representation in social conflict? That takes some really deep thought and research and digging into these core research questions. How are social problems identified as potential objects of collective action? How do certain social actors come to develop a sense of community and identity, as well as when we're talking about the collective we, W-E? That's a question. How can specific protests come to be perceived as part of the same conflict? Where do social movements relate, or as it relates to cultures, values, behaviors, identities, where do these things originate from? How can specific protests come to be perceived as a part of the same or different conflicts, or the interconnection or the intersectionality of conflicts? The third set of questions addresses the process through which values, interests, and ideas turn into collective action. That's a question. Now, how does it become possible to mobilize and to face the risk and the cost of protest activity? And there are some more embeddedness or challenges within that question. I just want to give you an idea of these things that you should think about, that you should question, that you should inquire about. What are the roles of identity, symbols, emotions, organizations, and networks? What are the roles and the explanation of the start and the persistence or the pursuance of collective action? What forms do organizations and institutions take in their strengths to maximize their strengths of what they oppose to collective challenges and their outcomes. Now, a final set of questions are what what does what explanation to the varying intensities over time does collective violence and other types of public challenges pose against power holders? Do the traits of political systems and their attitudes toward citizen demands influence these challengers, and how do these impacts in the political arena occur? How do protest tactics and strategies change over time, and why? So, class, I want you to consider all of these questions in this week's lecture, and also the different cultural habits and relationships, and the connections. How do these things tend to influence what forms of various social efforts that we as activists or being a part of social movements take? Now, in the 1950s and the 60s, those were specific time periods relative to economic prosperity for most of the country, making economic disparities and inequities in the United States more noticeable, more visible. Now, in addition to that, a national culture was emerging all at the same time that linked all Americans uh, more closely together based off of all of these questions that we're analyzing. And this emerging culture that linked all of us together more closely than ever before was the creation and the invention of the television. Now, the television became commonplace and allowed people and all of us to witness and connect to events happening in other parts of the country, and for that matter, across the entire world from a historical standpoint. In addition, we got to take into consideration during these time periods that more students were attending and graduating and getting educated from college, and this occurred well before World War II, creating a concentration of concerned, educated, and conscientious activists on the grounds of universities and colleges. So let's reach back to the 1930s. Now, the role of government became more important in American everyday lives, and people began to look to the government, toward the government, to resolve conflicts, to resolve problems. We look to the government. Now, after World War II in the United States competed with the USSR as it related to power. And the struggle was both a political struggle and some would say a moral campaign designed to influence people in Western democracy. Now, thus, this evolved in itself to bring greater force compared to what I would say, and what a lot of people and scholars and historians would say, the communist system adopted by the USSR. Now, during this period, Americans suffered through the Great Depression, the worst economic downturn historically in the United States. Now, we're making some history in present times as well as it relates to the economic downturn as it relates to COVID-19. And we have not seen the full ramifications of it yet. The full ramifications, that's going to take a little bit of time for all of that to be tallied and put in some data sets to really speak to the comparison of the economic depression of the 1930s compared to what we're dealing with today. So, based off of that historical context, to fight this widespread unemployment in the days of the Depression and widespread poverty, President Roosevelt created the New Deal program. And now, for the first time, when President Roosevelt created this program, the government took a major role in securing the welfare of its citizens, and Americans began to look to the government to provide constantly all of these benefits for the needy, for legal protection, and to help the helpless, and more. Now, the early successes of the unemployed movement in the 1930s were reversed when the movement ceased to present a real threat to the powers of that time during that time. So it's really important that you all understand that. So I just wanted to kind of present some of those, historical conflicts and analysis when it comes to addressing and really answering those core questions as it relates to social movement analysis. Now let's move on. I want to include this in this really brief lecture, the different types of social movements. Now, back in 1966, cultural anthropologist Dr. David Aberle identified 4 different kinds of social movements, and these social movements are contained in like blocks of quadrants. Now, the first set of what Dr. David Aberle really focused on was an alternative social movement. Now, the alternative social movement, followed by the redemptive social movement, followed by a reformative social movement, followed by a revolutionary social movement, make up those 4 quadrants. Now, these movements are broken down in terms on how promoting social changes and occurrences as we try to identify the type of social movement that the social movement really is. So, social movements might or can be viewed as change that is either innovative, traditional, and or conservative. Now, an innovative movement wants to introduce change or change norms and values. Now, while a conservative movement that seeks to protect existing norms and values. Now, I want you all to remember that the over and underlying theme of this class is collective action and activism. So remember, these 2 terms, along with other terms, will be used constantly, and I will be repeating them throughout the duration of the semester. So let's take an example. Let's take a look at some examples of an alternative, reformative, revolutionary, and redemptive social movement. So, an alternative movement seeks to get people to change their lifestyles. This type of movement is one that strives to change some aspects of an individual's behavior. Now, next is the redemptive social movement. Now, a redemptive social movement attempts to get people to make lifestyle, um, ultimate lifestyle changes. Um, and this social movement pretty much is one that seeks total personal transformative change and is typically religious in nature. So, an example of a religion is the spread of Christianity, as we'll look at that type of religious aspect as it relates to a redemptive social movement. Now, a redemptive social movement is radical in scope and it is focused strictly on the individuals and also groups of people. Now, next is a revolutionary social movement, and this type of social movement is designed to bring about major change, such as to overthrow different types of government or to eradicate a coup, COUP. Now, this type of revolutionary social movement is dedicated to carrying out revolutionary reforms and to gain some type of control of the state or government. Now, if the movement does not aim for exclusive control, revolutionary, it's not considered revolutionary at all. And a reform movement looks to change only some limited and or minor and most of all maybe some specific characteristics on how society functions. Now, this week we are gonna focus on these concepts, these theories, as it relates to social justice activism and social movement. So I want you to become very familiar with these terms. You will have supporting PowerPoint slides. I'm going to post the Cliff Notes versions of these terms. So you will be applying and demonstrating your understanding of these terms in this week's discussion board forum and all throughout the duration again of this semester as it relates to your final assignment at the right before we conclude the semester. These things you will be able to apply and discuss to your final exam paper assignment. So that's my Lecturecast for today. Please do not hesitate to contact me for any questions, any concerns that you may have for this week or any week in past weeks and in future weeks coming up. Now remember, you must review all of the information in the course module. You have to answer all of the discussion questions in their totality, and you must make sure that you respond to your fellow classmates' posts. You can respond to more than one of your classmates, or you can respond to several of your classmates' discussion board posts. That I'm going to leave that entirely up to you, but you must at least respond to one of your classmates' discussion board posts. So thank you all, and this concludes this week's Lecturecast class. I can't. Sorry. Thank you all, and this concludes this week's Lecturecast, and I want you all to have the best week that you possibly can. Remember, let me know if you have any questions or concerns via email, and take care all.